record. Oh, I'm getting pop-ups from parents.com that you guys probably, most of you don't care very much about. All right. So in addition to using the FIT principle when we're doing exercise programming, when you're trying to decide what should I have somebody do based upon their goals, or what should I be doing based upon my goals, there's another kind of set of principles. So FIT tells us kind of what it is, how often it is. PROS or PROS is going to denote some other things that we need to take under consideration. And these are not so much kind of the how and the what. These are going to be things that are going to get into why some programs work better than others. Okay, so if you have the FIT portion correct, right, you're getting a correct number of days per week. You are in theory getting at the right intensity and then the right or correct number of sets and reps and things. You can still not be as effective as you possibly can if you're missing out on these four principles. Okay, so PROS is gonna be an acronym for what we call progression, regularity, overload, and specificity. All right, so each one of these four is going to represent an important aspect of any training program or rehabilitative program that we're going to do. All right, so I'm gonna take them not necessarily in the order that they are listed. Okay, we're gonna hit the ones that I think are going to be probably the most self-explanatory first, and then we're going to take progression and overload kind of second on all of this. Okay, so of these four, if you're doing correctly by the FIT principle, then this idea of what is called regularity should be taken care of. Okay, regularity means you are being consistent, right? If I need to, I'm consistently getting my 2 to 4 days per week. I'm consistently getting my 3 to 4 sets on those particular days. Okay, so regularity just very simply means that I'm actually going and doing what is required of my exercise program. I think it's been about a week and a half since I have been able to go and exercise, so I am not right now being very good at regularity in my ability to exercise. Okay, so that's what regularity means. It's just consistently doing what your program tells you to do, right? And you all can probably appreciate that if you're not going regularly, then you're not giving yourself much of a stimulus to adapt. You're not going to get stronger. Your muscles aren't really going to get better. Okay. The last one, the S, stands for specificity. And so specificity is a little bit more, it requires a little bit more explanation. But what specificity is going to denote for us is that if you guys have ever heard, I don't want to use that example. That's a bad example. Let me think of a different one. Specificity means that you are going to get better when you do any kind of training program. You're going to get better specifically at whatever it is that you're doing. We mentioned this a little at the very end on Friday. But specificity means that if my goal is to get better at doing squats, then I need to do exercises that will specifically train the muscles that are being used when I do a squat, or that specifically mimic the similar range of motion that I go through when I do a squat. Okay, so if I want to get better at squatting, I shouldn't necessarily do bicep curls, or I shouldn't do overhead press. Okay, and that's the idea of specificity, that every program should have a goal, and that goal needs to be very, very specific to what your outcome is going to be, and that what you do when you train needs to be specific to that particular goal. Okay, and so a lot of training programs lack specificity, right? You know, people will say, I want to, I don't know, I want to get better at jumping higher, or I want to make my calves look more defined for whatever reason. Okay, and yet they don't do exercises that will specifically get at that. And so that's the idea of specificity. Okay. So the last two, progression and overload, of these four principles, okay, overload and progression really fit together. And of all of these things, overload is the single most important training principle that we can have. Okay. And overload in many ways matches up really, really well with the intensity component from the fit principle. Okay. Overload states very simply that whatever your body is used to being able to do, you have to do more in order to overload it. You must reach or go beyond what the body is accustomed to doing in an effort to get it to adapt and change and get better at doing that thing. Okay? So the problem with overload, and the reason that overload is the most commonly kind of missed principle, is that to overload is hard, right? If you're going to properly overload, you have to work hard. You have to lift heavier weights, or you have to lift and do more sets or more reps or an additional exercise that you're not used to and accustomed to doing. It is uncomfortable, right? And people don't like to do that. Psychologically, it's no fun. And sometimes you need people to motivate you or push you to do that, or to be there and cheer you on, whatever motivates you. But so for that reason, overload is the most commonly kind of underutilized principle, but it's also the single most important one. Okay. Does that make sense? Do you guys kind of understand then what overload is? And you can overload by lifting a heavier weight. You can overload by doing a couple more. If you're used to doing 10 repetitions with a given weight, do 11 or 12 repetitions with that weight. You can overload if I'm used to doing 2 sets, do a third set, okay? And so you can manipulate the overload in a lot of different ways, but the idea is to make sure that you're doing more than you're used to doing. In conjunction with that comes this idea of what we call progression. And so progression is this idea that as you overload and as you do things consistently, the body's going to begin to adapt. So you're going to get stronger. So I've been doing something for a month, right? And I've been overloading and doing really well for a month. I've been doing my three days per week, my 4 sets of 10 reps at, say 80% of my 1 rep max. I've been doing really good for a month. Well, in that month, you have gotten stronger, okay? And so the idea now is that whatever weight I'd been lifting is now no longer going to be sufficient to overload my muscles. So I must progress and retest my 1 rep max, figure out how much stronger I've gotten, so that now I can adjust. Even if I'm doing the same percentage of my max weight, if my max weight I can lift is going up, I can adjust, and now I'm lifting a heavier weight for those 10 repetitions or 8 repetitions or whatever. So I've progressed over time. And the problem is, if we don't properly progress over the course of time with an exercise program, you lose overload. And if you lose the overload, you lose the stimulus to continue to adapt and continue to get stronger and to continue to try to make your muscles get bigger. Okay? Does that make sense, everybody? Are you guys with me on all of that? Because these are the principles that I'm going to ask you all to apply when you're doing your critique and evaluating your program. Okay? And so when you find a lot of exercise programs in a magazine or online, many times they will talk a little bit about overload, okay? But a lot of times they don't talk about progression specifically. They don't say, all right, after a month, we want you to retest your maximal strength and adjust what you're doing accordingly in the coming weeks based upon all of that. And so in that way, many programs don't talk about sort of progression. Okay. The other way to kind of account for progression in a less formal way is to simply look at, I'm going to lift 3 sets of 10 repetitions, okay? And I'm always using a weight that I can do about 10 times, and I can't do it 11. And so this week, that's 100 pounds. Well, next week on my first day of doing this, I lifted that 100 pounds. I did 11 reps, okay? And the week after next, I did it 12 reps. You're like, all right, so now I'm probably getting stronger. I should add 5 pounds. I'm going to add a little bit of weight, and now I'm back down to doing 10 reps again. And when I can do 11 or 12, then I'm going to add a little bit more weight on top of all of that, okay? So it doesn't have to be as formalized as I'm retesting my 1 rep max, and I'm going to really, really kind of dial it in, although that's the best way to do it, okay? So does that make sense, guys? Most people don't lift enough, so they don't overload. Therefore, they do not maximize their strength and muscle size gains. And then a lot of people, they may initially have some overload, but they don't challenge themselves and progress their training as they move forward. And they've been lifting the exact same weight, doing the exact same workout for, say, 6 months, and they wonder why they're no longer getting any stronger and their muscles aren't getting any bigger. It's because it's become easy, and they're not challenging themselves enough. Okay? All right, questions about that. So for your critique tomorrow, right? I know that I gave you guys a grading rubric, but what would be really, really helpful when you all do this is you're going to provide me your article or a link to your article or a link to your workout, but just write out, okay? Frequency, and then write out what it says that thing says to do. Intensity, how are they denoting intensity? Or they don't say anything about intensity. They've not done a good job there. Time, type, and then write out progression, right? Repetition, overload, specificity. Be very, very prescriptive and sort of make some notes for yourself and for me on, are they hitting all of those things? And if they're not, which they may not, just say they did not do a good job. They do not mention anything about repetition. They do not mention anything about overload. Okay. So I don't think that they're doing that. And then that will help you guys to organize it so that when you make your recommendations on what could they change, what could they add, you just got to go back and look at that list and everything else. Okay. All right. So I'm going to minimize you guys back down. We talk about progression, regularity. We talked about overload. We talked a little bit about specificity. Let's talk about safety issues very, very quickly. When we are doing assessments, okay, when we are, like if we had been in lab and we were measuring your maximal strength or we were doing the push-up test, okay, things to keep in mind is that supervision and providing proper instructions on proper form for doing those exercises is very, very key. The big issue behind that is it keeps people safe. It may keep them from getting hurt. We always want to start people, if they've not ever done a certain exercise before, have them do it maybe on a weight machine with a very, very light weight. When you use weight machines rather than free weights or something that uses a barbell rather than a dumbbell, is that it limits their range of motion a little bit. And it kind of locks them in. If you're going to sit in a bench press machine, it only lets you do this. You don't have to balance a bar. You don't have to worry about, am I bringing the weight down too fast, or am I bringing it down to where it's going to bounce on my chest or something like that? Or if I'm going to do a squat, I'm going to go all the way down and I'm going to go too far. If you do things on machines, we can kind of teach people early on, and then we can progress our way up to doing something that's a little bit more difficult. The training environment is really key. We don't cover a lot of this in this particular class, but heat stress and heat illness is a really, really dangerous thing. We would love for the temperature when we're exercising to be somewhere between 68 and 72. As the temperature rises, then heat stress is going to go up. And it's less of an issue for resistance training, but for aerobic training where you may sweat even more, then heat illness can become a big issue. All of the manuals will talk about having a proper warm up and a cool down and then doing some stretching when you're done. There's not a huge amount of research that is suggestive that doing a warm up or a cool down is necessarily that vital. there's not a lot of research that says if I don't warm up that I'm at a greater chance of injuring something. Generally, though, like kind of doing some walking and moving through a range of motion and getting yourself limbered up beforehand, usually you may feel a little bit better, but it's not necessarily going to keep you from like pulling a hamstring or something like that. Okay, but just kind of keep those things in mind. So the last little bit of things that we have on all of this is this idea of what's called periodization. And so periodization is, we actually teach an entire class just based on periodization. We have an advanced resistance training methods course. And what they talk about with periodization is, let's say that I know a year from now, let's just say, okay, a year from now, I need to go and compete in the Olympics. But the idea of periodization is that I need to vary how I'm training and what I'm doing over the course of the next year in an effort to kind of be at my peak physical performance right when I have to do my competition. Okay, so maybe it's the summer, you're in the off season for a particular sport, and then when we go back to school, then you're in the preseason for that particular sport. Say it's basketball, and then I'm going to start the season in November or December, then I'm going to be in season in that way. So the idea of doing periodization is that we change how we train from the off season to the preseason to in season, or I change how I train based upon off season versus maybe I'm a track athlete or I'm a swimmer and I have several really, really, really big competitions at the end of my season, right? So I want to, even early in the season, I'm going to train in a certain way to kind of help myself peak at the very end. And that's the idea of periodization, okay, is I'm going to change how I train based upon the individualized goal that I have at a certain time. And if you know that it's going to take, say, a couple of weeks to see noticeable increases in strength, and it may take 8 weeks to see noticeable increases in muscle size, then you can map out what it is that you're doing, kind of work backwards from when you need to be at your level of peak performance. There's some terminology with that, things called a macrocycle, a mesocycle, and a microcycle. A macrocycle is just this big kind of overarching like year-long thing. A mesocycle may be kind of several months. So I'm in a preseason mesocycle, or I'm in a off-season mesocycle, and then a macrocycle may be how you define what you're doing from a training portion for this week or a couple of weeks or something. If you guys want to know more about this, the bros take their periodization really, 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 I cannot emphasize this enough, really seriously, okay? There are lots of theories about periodization and what's the best way to do things. But the research evidence is somewhat lacking on this. We think that periodization is useful, but there are lots of ideas on, should I change what I do every week? Should I change what I do every 2 weeks? Should I change what I do every other workout within a week? Should I go up in weight over the course of time? Should I go down in weight over the course of time? Everybody has a different idea. And there's not a lot of research evidence that one is particularly better than another. But if you're interested in that, I would be happy to talk with you guys either out of class or something about that. Or I would encourage you to take our advanced resistance training course because they go into a lot more depth about all of that. Okay. All right. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to stop my screen share. I'm going to